Hello there, I'm Rosanna Lockwood. Welcome to the very first ever COP29 Daily Show in partnership with High Impact. Well, welcome to Baku, day one of the United Nations Climate Conference COP29. For 11 days, the epicenter of the world, as more than 100 world leaders descend here on the Olympic Stadium every day, we will be bringing you the best of the action from here at COP29, from the heart of the negotiations to the activity behind the scenes. Here in the studio, the Daily Show will be bringing together some of the key players shaping COP29, along with the people on the front line working on climate solutions and those suffering most from climate disasters. Let's take a look then, shall we, at what is coming up on today's show. On the opening day, are you still confused by what COP29 actually is? We'll help explain. Former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, running the Institute for Global Change, now tells us what he thinks could be and should be achieved here. And talking negotiations, the Maldivian Prime Minister takes us behind the scenes of how those negotiations work. But let's get out of the studio for a moment, shall we? YouTube creator Wadi Maya from Ghana is out in the thick of it for us. He's contributing to the show. So good to see you there, Wadi.
Hey Rosanna, it's great to be here. This is my first time at COP. This place is super huge. Literally the entire world is present in here. And you know what? All day today, I've been walking around speaking to delegates just to find out what COP is all about. And later on the show, you all will find out.
Certainly will. That's Wadi Maya for us, and you're going to see a lot more of him throughout the show and throughout the next 2 weeks as well. It's great to have him on board. So you've seen a bit of what COP29 looks like, but what exactly is COP? Let's find out. Well, COP opened officially this morning. Mukhtar Babayev, Azerbaijan's Minister for Ecology and Natural Resources, is the new COP29 president, and it's his job to run COP29 for the host country, Azerbaijan.
Ladies and gentlemen, we must be totally honest. The UN Environmental Programme shows that current policies are leading us to 3 degrees of warming. These temperatures would be catastrophic for billions. They would threaten the existence of communities representatives in this room. Colleagues, we are on the road to ruin. But these are not the future problems. Climate change is already here. From flooded homes in Spain to forest fires in Australia, from rising oceans in the Pacific to barren plains in East Africa. Whether you see them or not, people are suffering in the shadows. They are dying in the dark, and they need more than compassion, more than prayers and paperwork, and they're crying out for leadership and action.
Well, Simon Steele is Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the part of the United Nations that runs COP. Here's what he had to say.
This UNFCCC process is the only place we have to address the rampant climate crisis and to credibly hold each other to account, to act on it. And we know this process is working because without it, humanity would be headed towards 5 degrees of global warming. In these halls, we negotiate on specific pieces of the puzzle each year. It can feel far away from what's happening in Florence's living room. We cannot afford to continue upending lives and livelihoods in every nation.
Well, now we're really pleased to have with us here in the studio former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, who is now running the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. So great to have you with us.
Thank you.
And I'll start putting you on the spot a little bit, but we're very curious to know how many COPs you reckon you've been to?
I can't remember.
And that's a great answer, because it's been a lot, hasn't it?
It's been a lot. But I was involved in the very first treaty, the Kyoto Treaty, back in 1997, 98. And, you know, back then it was all about trying to persuade people that climate change was a problem. And so for, I would say, the best part of 2 decades, the argument was, no, it really is a problem. And people were saying, well, we're not sure, or there's some people denying it. But actually, I think now everyone accepts as a problem. The question is, what's the solution that's going to work?
That's what I was going to ask you. So you do think there's been progress made on the world accepting it is a problem?
I think there's been massive progress made on the world accepting it's a problem. There are very few people who don't say that there's any issue on climate change, because people see whatever part of the world you're in, you can see the climate changing. So I don't think that's such a problem. And there has been significant progress on some of the solutions. But the problem is the world keeps developing. And therefore, whereas the developed world was responsible for creating the problem through its industrialization, the developed world's emissions will be a declining percentage of the total over time. And the developing world, because it wants and needs to develop for its people, will become a larger and larger element. And the question, therefore, is how do you get the financial flows going from the developed world to the developing world? How do you make sure that when countries like Indonesia and the Philippines and Vietnam in Southeast Asia, and then, of course, in time, Africa, how do they grow, but do it in a way that doesn't keep adding to the emissions? So this is the challenge. You've got finance, and then you've got technology, which is the other big challenge.
One of the big urgencies is obviously mitigating, as they call it in UN language, but the use of fossil fuels, the reliance on that. And you say that is eventually going to go down, not up, but they are predicted to keep rising until at least 2030. So, I mean, what can really be done about that?
Yeah, so what can be done is 2 things. You've got to make sure that when it's possible, because you've got the opportunities through, for example, renewable energy, when countries in the developing world are increasing their power production, power generation, they could be doing it more sustainably with renewable energy. In Africa, for example, there are massive opportunities for hydropower, for geothermal power. So the solution for solar, of course, in Africa, but you need the financing. So that's the challenge. And you're absolutely right. The fossil fuel production is going to continue to rise. It may peak in 2030, but we need it to peak sooner if at all possible, and then we need for it to start declining. And the other aspect of this is technology. There are new technologies being developed, and we're going to have to try and accelerate those so that we can get them deployed. Otherwise, frankly, meeting these climate targets is going to be really tough. Let's
focus back on why we're here, why you are here, and we're here on this COP29 Daily Show in Baku, because what can COP do, this UN climate change conference? What can it do to help with that, to help fix
so the COPs really have 2 purposes. One is to be a global platform so that people, because often the countries with the least power are going to be the most affected by climate change, right? Some of the poorest countries, for example, in the Sahel in Africa, or a lot of the island states, they don't have huge amounts of money or power, but they're going to be really affected by climate change. And one purpose of COP is to give people a voice so that people can come and they can put pressure on the international community. But the second, and perhaps in the end, the most important, is you get countries to commit to things that can offer solutions. So this COP will very much be around finance, where the organizers of the COP, the government of Azerbaijan, will be trying to improve the amount of finance that goes to improve our chances of beating climate change, and then also to try and, they've got a particular idea around how you make carbon markets work more effectively so that you generate more money from the developed world to the developing world.
Look, you mentioned those carbon markets. It's something I want to talk to you about. It's a big agenda point here, and I think it's something that you probably are looking into quite a lot in the work that you're doing now. Before we go any further, do our audience a massive favour and try and explain in simple terms what carbon markets are and why they're important.
Well, carbon markets are important because if you are emitting, right, the question is how you manage to use that in order to then in the developing world, people you put a value on that, and then you transfer that to the developing world, so they're actually investing in energy in that developing world. So the whole point about a carbon market is that you allow people to trade emissions, right? So the people that are emitting can then help reduce the impact of their carbon footprint by putting money into the developing world. So the problem has always been with the carbon markets that it's been difficult to make them transparent. So, for example, people might want to invest in preventing deforestation, right? So you have to make sure that that system has integrity, so people really see that what you say you're doing, you're actually doing, right? And the problem has always been with the carbon markets, making sure they operate effectively, transparently, in a way that allows us to get more money into those developing world into the developing world that needs that money.
So you think it's an effective system to be
It
cleaning up and sorting out and getting...
It's effective. I mean, there are criticisms that people make of it because they think you're giving the emitters a free pass. But in the end, you know, there will be industries and there will be countries that will continue to emit. So to have a system of trading for emissions and emissions reductions is, I think, a perfectly sensible thing to do.
So is that going to be part of your conversations going on here at COP?
Yeah, absolutely.
What else will you be looking at? What would be your measure of success from this COP?
Well, I think first of all, that you actually get the amount of money that is flowing from the developed world to the developing world. And that can happen, it can happen directly. It can happen also through, through the institutions like the World Bank and other multilateral institutions, providing guarantees, providing concessionary loans for the developing world to be able to invest in renewable energy. You see, the problem is that every year, a lot of these developing countries are going to be increasing their power generation. And they will want to be building airports, having well-functioning airlines and travel, right? So unless you find a way where you're allowing the investment in renewable energy to happen much more quickly, so you're getting people then investing in, solar and renewable and so on, and unless you find ways, for example, with aviation, of making sure that people are going to be able to travel, but using sustainable aviation fuel, it's going to be really hard to make the climate change debate work, because we know, for example, airline travel is going to double over the next 20 years.
Yeah.
And therefore, the whole point that, as I always say to people about climate change, is you're not going to stop people consuming. The world will carry on growing. You can't say to a leader of a poor country whose people desperately need electricity, connectivity, who need the road transport and so on, you can't say to them, don't develop. What you can do, if you provide the finance and the means, is say, here's a way of doing it sustainably, not damaging the environment.
And have the developed countries and all the
this is a responsibility of the developed countries. Look, we created the problem, but as I say to people, the fact that we created the problem means that we've got a responsibility to deal with it, but dealing with it over time is going to be more and more about how we deliver the finance and the technology to the developing world.
Well, we'll let you get on with that work. I know you've got plenty to be getting on with here at COP. Thank you very much, former Prime Minister of the UK and Executive Chair of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Tony Blair.
Thank you.
Well, coming up after the break, we'll take you on a tour around COP and find out how climate negotiations actually work. Welcome back to The Daily Show at COP29 in partnership with High Impact. I'm Rosanna Lockwood. Now, where exactly are we? And what's going on here? Well, let's go back to YouTuber Wadi Maya from Ghana, who has been joining us throughout the show. He has been finding out some stuff for you, and he's going to tell us all about it, what he's seen on site today. Hey there, Wadi.
A quick reminder that COP is split into two, which is the blue zone and the green zone. Where I am right now is actually the blue zone. It's not open for the public. Only delegates are allowed in here. And this place is actually controlled by the UN. But don't forget that my day started with you guys in the green zone. Rehearsals for the Daily Show will be happening in here. They'll be coming at you live every single day from the first day to the last day. And it's my first time at COP, and it's super exciting to be here. We are currently at the green zone, and I got Charlie right here. What is the green zone all about?
So green zone in concept is the public-facing element of COP. It gives the public more wide accessibility to what's going on.
It's about time for me to take you all to the blue zone, and we're gonna take a bit of a walk, so why not come along with me? We finally made it. Let's go inside. This is where the exact climate change conversation is happening, because we currently have over 197 countries in here. This is delegate pavilions where different countries have their stand. Right behind me is Great Britain, and this is the Japan stand. And believe me or not, the people of Japan are more like in another world. We are in 2030, but I believe that Japanese are just in 2060 by now. Bokuno na mayo amaya this.
Wow, surprised why you speak Japanese. We introduced the zero carbon building. Zero.
Rwanda is representing.
Just really showcasing Rwanda and focusing on climate finance.
It feels so good to be back home. This is Ghana, and I want to welcome you all. Akwaba.
Ghana plays a very key role in the climate change agenda. So we need to be part of this process to ensure that we are contributing in the right direction and also benefiting from what other countries are doing.
All these people that you see in here are trying to get into the room. But guess what? The main event will be happening tomorrow, where we're going to have over 100 world leaders coming in here to talk about our future. And I can't wait to share all the exciting news with you all. So on this note, see you tomorrow.
Well, one of the things we'll do on The Daily Show is look not just at climate problems, but also solutions. Everyone here is trying to reach agreement on climate action, but how do the negotiations actually work to get them there? Well, with me now here in the studio is someone representing more than 60 countries vulnerable to climate change, as well as his own, somebody with a huge amount of experience in negotiations, former president of the Maldives, and Secretary General of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. Thank you, Mohamed Nasheed, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Well, let's just get straight into it and talk about the negotiations at COP. We've got so many people here, world leaders, you've got government, private sector as well. We're really focusing on the leadership side and the government side at the moment. How would you explain what the negotiations are at COP?
Well, in any negotiations, you have two sides. On the one hand, you have developing countries who feel that they have to take a lot of the brink, the challenges of climate change, not because of anything that they've done. On the other hand, you have big emitting countries, historically big emitting countries as well, who have been emitting carbon for a very long time, and therefore the reason for what we are facing, the climate change impacts that we are seeing now. As we all know, the waves are higher, the winds are stronger, the rains are more, the droughts are longer. So the challenges are bigger. Now, in negotiations, as I mentioned, on the one hand, the developing countries feel that the developed countries must contribute for adaptation, how they may be able to meet these challenges. And also, developing countries feel that developed countries must reduce their emissions. They must spend more money on energy transition. They must find ways of development without carbon emission.
I just want to focus on the way meetings are done here and the way conversations are had. We've got more than 100 world leaders or so coming to this summit. The World Leaders Summit kicking off tomorrow. We're going to hear powerful speeches. You're going to see those rooms full of flags. All looks very impressive. But how much progress is actually made in those meetings and how much is actually done behind the scenes?
It's mostly done behind the scenes. The speeches that you see, well, of course, they are necessary for messaging, but the agreements, the understandings, the negotiations happen well in advance. Negotiators have been working for the last 2 weeks. They've been here and they've been trying to find out a text that all parties can agree to. So they have these brackets in the text. The idea would be to remove these brackets. To remove the brackets, you bring in other language that both sides can agree upon. So it's finding the terms, finding the idea. It's the language, not necessarily the language, but the impact behind the language. So the idea would be to see how these brackets can be removed with terms and language that all of us can agree upon.
You mentioned that in advance point and how much is done in advance of actually coming here. I want to ask you about that because famously you held a set of negotiations underwater, and I'm sure you've talked about this a lot in your career, but this really was a scene-stealing moment. Mr. Mohamed, Nasheed, President of the Maldives, they're signing this agreement underwater. Presumably you couldn't have had that conversation underwater, so you did all of the negotiations beforehand.
Yes.
That was just the kind of set piece. Is that similar to what goes on here? It's just a signing process.
Well, when the leaders actually sign, it's just a signing process. But you have the civil servants, you have the actual negotiators from our countries coming here well in advance, and then talking about it and seeing how countries can agree. Now, very often you have blocks of countries. We've had this G77 plus China bloc for a long time. There's also an Africa bloc. There's also a small island developing states bloc. I mean, there's countries landlocked. There's countries mountainous. There's countries with deserts. So these countries have similar challenges. And they tend to group together and find a text that they can all agree upon, and then hopefully share among others, and then come to a final text. These COPs, the last few COPs have been mostly about finance. Previously, it was about emission, to reduce your carbon emission. But now, because the planet has actually heated, that 2024, the planet has heated 1.5 degrees above the industrial age. And so the impact is now felt by countries. And countries now need to adapt. Now, for adaptation, you need a whole lot of money. If you look at a climate vulnerable country, they are spending about 30% of their income on breakwaters, embankments, revetments, adaptation measures. And then, after they've spent 30% on that, they are also very often debt-ridden. And they spend about another 20% of their income on debt repayment. And they have very little money for, in fact, for development or for education or for health. So this climate is becoming a huge difficulty for a number of climate vulnerable countries.
And that's what this COP is all about. It's getting all of those developed countries together to make sure that the funding is there for the vulnerable ones.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap things there, but really appreciate having you with us. Mohamed Nasheed, former President of the Maldives and Secretary General of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That is indeed all we have time for on the very first Daily Show at COP29. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up on the Daily Show tomorrow, the 2-day World Leaders Summit on Climate Action begins. At 12 o'clock, the summit is opened by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. Then at 2 p.m, heads of state and governments begin their speeches. Also at 2, the work begins with the COP President Mukhtar Babayev meeting the head of the International Energy Agency to talk about climate mitigation. And don't forget, you can see the full programme via the QR code. So that's goodbye from Baku on our first day of the COP29 Daily Show in partnership with High Impact. But don't go anywhere. Do join us again tomorrow for day 2.